honesty, a bit of a shock. It just seemed out of character. At the very end of the video, however, we get an explanation for Harris's pivot to political idealist, which, for anyone who values journalism in any way, should be deeply worrying. In the final minute, when realistically most people will have stopped watching, Harris reveals that this video was produced in partnership with an organisation called the World Economic Forum. He tells us how great the World Economic Forum is and encourages us to buy a book by their founder and current executive chairman, Klaus Schwab. We'll talk in a second about what the World Economic Forum is, but in short, this is a promotional video. And not only in the sense of containing a brief plug within it, but in the sense that from beginning to end, this is an advert. It may be dressed up as essentially an independently created episode of Borders, yet this is not journalism. This is a piece of propaganda, produced in very close partnership with, in fact, as we'll see shortly, seemingly co-written by a very senior PR executive from an organisation which no journalist should be uncritically echoing the talking points of. The same guy who 2 months previously was bemoaning the state of journalism was now, even if not selling, at the very least lending his platform and journalistic reputation to exactly the kind of organisation which we expect journalists to be critical of. So, in order to get a sense of why someone who presents themselves as a journalist creating sponsored content of this kind is so worrying, I think it's useful to begin by taking a brief look at what the World Economic Forum is. For Harris describes it merely as a think tank, and its frankly quite boring name makes it sound fairly harmless, right? Well, to use the proper terminology, the World Economic Forum is an international, non-governmental organisation, or NGO. What this means is that it is essentially a campaigning group, which attempts to persuade both national governments and supranational organisations, such as the United Nations and the European Union, to implement certain political and economic policies. Many large charities are NGOs. Alongside its direct aid and poverty relief activities, for example, the charity Oxfam also operates as an NGO which advocates for the adoption of policies which alleviate poverty and suffering. If Oxfam advocates for an end to poverty, then what does the World Economic Forum campaign for? Well, on its website, the forum describes itself, again in cryptic corporate speak, as the International Organisation for Public-Private Cooperation. Continuing that, the forum engages the foremost political, business, cultural and other leaders of society to shape global, regional and industry agendas. In short, it seeks to bring presidents, prime ministers and other governmental figures together with CEOs and business leaders to encourage them to think about how they might work together to, as the forum describes it, make positive change. As the notion of stakeholder capitalism that Johnny Harris discusses in his video suggests, the World Economic Forum tends to remain fairly vague about exactly what positive change they are working towards. We can begin to get some idea of the kind of policies that the forum might promote, however, by taking a look at how it's funded. For whilst the World Economic Forum claims to be independent, impartial, and not tied to any special interests, its annual revenue of just over $408 million as of 2020 comes mostly from the fees paid by global corporations such as Apple, Amazon, Google, Pfizer, Lockheed Martin, Nestle, the Coca-Cola Company, Goldman Sachs, and pretty much every other significant global company to be partners of the forum, to attend its glitzy events, and to shape the policies that it advocates for. Now, some draw on the World Economic Forum's function as essentially an advocacy and membership organisation for the richest companies in the world as the basis for highly spurious conspiracy theories. To give the most recent example of this, a key part of the World Economic Forum's activities is its organisation of the annual Davos Summit. in which billionaires, business leaders and heads of state gather in the resort town of Davos in the Swiss Alps to discuss the future of global economics and politics. The 2021 event, which, owing to the continuing COVID-19 pandemic, took place online and which, as we'll see, Johnny Harris's video was produced to coincide with, saw the World Economic Forum launch an initiative which it called the Great Reset. Online conspiracy theorists soon took this foreboding title as proof that Bill Gates and the rest of the global elite were finally getting round to establishing the New World Order. The truth is more mundane. As the journalist George Monbiot put it on Twitter, the Great Reset is basically a cynical rebranding of capitalism as a force for good. For the most part, it's an attempt to convince us that the World Economic Forum and its corporate partners recognise the various economic and ecological crises which our present economic system has engendered, and to make it seem as though they're going to do something about it. In reality, very little will actually change, at least when it comes to dealing with inequality and the climate emergency. In a recent article for The Intercept, Naomi Klein concurs, pointing out that this kind of rebranding exercise is nothing new for the forum. Since the early 2000s, the World Economic Forum, and the Davos Summit in particular, have become a platform for global corporations to feign regret about the human and environmental consequences of their business practices. They regularly invite climate and inequality activists to give them a public dressing down in front of the world's press. It was at Davos in 2019 that Greta Thunberg declared that our house is on fire. That same year, the Dutch journalist Rutger Bregman garnered global headlines when he implored the summit to start talking about taxes, by which he meant that the rich needed to be paying more tax and that governments needed to be cracking down on tax avoidance. Both Thunberg and Bregman's comments received solemn nods and gracious applause from Davos attendees, but led to zero material action. Davos and the World Economic Forum, then, are essentially where the richest 1% go to pretend to have a conscience. While I'm sure there's plenty of backroom wheeling and dealing which is facilitated by the World Economic Forum, in terms of its public-facing activities, it serves as a means for global corporations and the super-rich to repeatedly pretend to have seen the error of their ways and to be on the cusp of change before they go back to their boardrooms to carry on with business as usual. The World Economic Forum's decision to work with Johnny Harris to create a video about how companies such as Apple and Walmart are currently enthusiastically moving away from shareholder capitalism and towards this vague notion of stakeholder capitalism is just another in a long line of examples of the forum attempting to convince us that, against all the evidence, they are even remotely concerned about anything other than profit. For the purposes of today's video, however, I'm not overly interested in the specific claims that Harris makes in how China became so powerful. Instead, I'm interested in the partnership between Harris and the World Economic Forum that led to him making those claims in the first place, and the warning that it represents about the growing trend of governments and advocacy organisations such as the World Economic Forum using YouTube and YouTube creators to spread propaganda and disinformation, and why we should be particularly worried about this trend in instances where those creators purport to be journalists. So this video isn't propaganda, but this portion of it has been sponsored by the fantastic VPN services of Surfshark. Protect yourself online by heading over to surfshark.deals/Tom Nicholas to get 83% off a 2-year plan and an extra 3 months for free, allowing you to securely and privately browse the web for just $2.21
So I've talked a lot recently about
whether you're a journalist or not, keeping your online activity hidden from the prying eyes of internet service providers and increasingly tracker-ridden websites is currently more important than ever, with with so many of us working from home.
Since its start, Angry Birds has remained an iconic series that
can enable you to do this quickly and easily with no advanced tech knowledge required, by essentially creating a private internet connection to keep you safe and secure whenever
on YouTube
you're online.
for 7 years.
Surfshark is packed full of features, such as their clean web mode, which not only blocks trackers and malware, but also ads, and which I found has made my browsing experience infinitely more pleasurable. You can also use it to trick